What's up, everyone? This is Phillip Lew, and in this video, I'm going to break down the teachings of Ramana Maharshi. And for those of you who don't know who he is, he's a spiritual teacher that was born in the late 19th century, but really became prominent more in the early 20th century for teaching the idea of what we could call self-inquiry. He was famous for the idea of how to achieve self-realization. And those who have a direct experience of being around him have reported that the man had a very powerful presence, a powerful silence, a powerful aura of what we could call transcendence or self-realization. I wanted to do this video in particular because I really believe that Ramana Maharshi is one of the greatest examples of spiritual enlightenment, really in the 20th century or even in the 21st century. And one of the challenges is that, frankly, his words, his writing can be really difficult to really understand what the hell he's actually talking about. And so what we're going to do is we're going to listen to his writing as read by a Western reader. So that way we can make sure the accent's easy to understand. We can clearly grasp at least his words. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it down section by section in the areas that I think are most relevant. This is actually my first time watching this video too. So as always, I'll be doing a reaction slash explainer. We're going to break it down section by section and really attempt to understand the true nature of what Ramana talks about in his various writings. So I'm excited. We're going to get into the nature of reality, the nature of ego, how to achieve enlightenment as taught by Ramana. And I'm going to do my best to take his writing and make it accessible and comprehensible and understandable to as many of you as possible. So let's just get into the video.
If there be a goal to be reached, it cannot be permanent. The goal must already be there. We seek to reach the goal with the ego, but the goal exists before the ego. What is in the goal is even prior to our birth, to the birth of the ego. Because we exist, the ego appears to exist too. If we look on the self as the ego, then we become the ego. If as the mind, we become the mind. If as the body, we become the body. It is the thought which builds up sheaths in so many ways. The shadow on the water is found to be shaking. Can anyone stop the shaking of the shadow? If it should cease to shake, you would not notice the water, but only the light. Similarly, to take no notice of the ego and its activities, but see only the light behind. The ego is the I thought. The true I is the self.
All right. So he already just dropped the hammer, honestly. But it's extremely difficult to understand what he's talking about, unless you have a direct experience of enlightenment for yourself. So for those of you who might benefit from a little bit of commentary, so when he ultimately says that there is like the goal has essentially you're already enlightened. The objective of all spiritual practice is the achievement of spiritual enlightenment, yet you're already enlightened, right? We hear this from many spiritual teachers. Like, what does that actually mean? What it essentially means is that who you truly are or a better pronoun would be what you truly are, because what you truly are is transpersonal. In other words, it transcends personhood, it transcends individual identity, and it is the all-encompassing field of pure consciousness or pure awareness. Okay. But in order for that to make sense, we have to first understand what we ordinarily identify ourselves as, which is this idea of an ego. The ego is the pronoun who. Who am I? I am a person named Phillip Lew who speaks English, who's creating this video right now. This is my personhood. This is my ego identity. What I truly am is the consciousness behind this person. And as Ramana used in his writing, is he used the word the light behind the ego. So when we say that you're already enlightened and that you don't have to achieve enlightenment because you're already enlightened, really what that gets to is a very nuanced and profound understanding of spirituality, which is essentially the idea that the achievement of spiritual enlightenment is not the learning of what you really are, but it's the unlearning of what you're really not. And as you dissolve the layers of the egoic mind, you awaken, or a better word that we could use is you remember what you truly are, which is this higher dimensional consciousness. Now, in order to dissolve the egoic mind, this is the entire subject of what Ramana is going to talk about, hopefully, and we can learn a little bit more about how to do that. But the first thing that will hopefully make this clear is that we're trying to understand what we truly are by recognizing that we already are what we truly are, right? You cannot not be yourself. So ultimately, the goal is the removal of illusion so that we can awaken to the true nature of what we really are.
Realization is already there. The state free from thoughts is the only real state. There is no such action as realization. Is there anyone who is not realizing the self? Does anyone deny his own existence? Speaking of realization, it implies two selves, the one to realize, the other to be realized. What is not already realized is sought to be realized. Once we admit our existence, how is it that we do not know the self? Oh, because of the thoughts, the mind. Quite so. It is the mind that stands between and veils our happiness. How do we know that we exist? If you say because of the world around us, then how do you know that you existed in deep sleep? How to get rid of the mind? Is it the mind that wants to kill itself?
So before we talk about how to get rid of the mind, I want to give a little bit of commentary and explanation on why the mind is what separates you from what you really are. So, there's a lot of different definitions of mind, and this is one of the challenges of spirituality and the achievement of enlightenment is actually having a clear and well-defined understanding of mind. So, my definition of mind that I use is mind is the totality of your individual personhood. So that's your thoughts, your emotions, your actions, your beliefs, your behavior, right? We could call it your thoughts, emotions, sensations, perceptions, and actions. The totality of that sort of fluctuating conglomerate of thoughts, emotions, sensations, perceptions makes up your egoic mind, your personality, or your individuality or personhood. This is the egoic mind. So ultimately, when he says the only true state, this is what Ramana said in his writing, the only true state is one that is free from thoughts. That is both correct, but also not entirely accurate. It's true in the sense of the egoic mind rises up in the form of a thought. I am Phillip Lew. I am a person. I am in the world. And when I identify with myself as this, I am a person, and I'm having thoughts as an individual, yes, that is the egoic mind. But the egoic mind also includes all of my emotions. It includes all of my sensations, all of my perceptions of reality. All of that is part of the egoic mind structure. So, what you really are is the consciousness that is not identified with thought, emotions, sensations, and perceptions. And so, part of the process of awakening is coming to the realization that this person that you've been walking around identified with your entire life is not the true nature of what you really are. And what's also really important to understand here, too, is when we talk about this idea of dissolving the ego or ego death, right? These are also misunderstandings, in my view, because you're not ultimately killing the ego. Okay. You're not ultimately dissolving the ego, right? Because like when you are an enlightened being, you're not walking around like I am not a person. I am, you know, um, I am pure consciousness. Like you're not walking around completely divorced from your personality. That makes no sense. That makes absolutely no sense. In fact, when you awaken into enlightenment, you are very much aware of your personality and you enjoy it, right? You can think of it like an outfit. You can put on the outfit of personality, right? But then when you're done, you can take it off and you know what you truly are, the raw, naked version of your true self. So enlightenment isn't the destruction or death or dissolving of the egoic mind per se. We can use those words, and I use those words too in my books and my writing, but for very nuanced, clear understanding with perfect terminology, it would be better to say that enlightenment is when you are no longer solely identified as the egoic mind, that you awaken to your transcendent pure consciousness, the silence beyond thought, emotion, sensation, perception, allowing you to coexist as both the person as well as the awareness of the person. And so there's really what it really is it's not the dissolving of individuality completely. It's your ability to recognize that individuality is connected to a higher dimensional identity that is impersonal and non-local in nature, that transcends space and time as understood. And that is not something that the mental mind can understand, but you can experience it directly as you awaken deeper and deeper and deeper into higher consciousness. Or we could say, as you awaken deeper and deeper and deeper into the silence of your witnessing consciousness that goes beyond mental thought forms and transient emotional experiences. Okay. So the goal isn't just the most important thing before we talk about how to remove the mind. The goal isn't to remove the mind so that you're walking around as a no mind, like without a personality, without individuality. No, that's not what's happening here as I teach it. What's happening here is you are awakening to a sense of understanding that you're both the person, the world, and that which is aware of both. That your identity isn't limited to your personality, but includes a transcendent dimension within yourself that is beyond the person, allowing you to live deeply in the world, but to know yourself not of the world. Okay, so you're adding to your identity. You're not subtracting, if that makes sense.
Self, the mind cannot kill itself. So your business is to find the real nature of the mind. Then you will know that there is no mind. When the self is sought, the mind is nowhere. Abiding in the self, one need not worry about the mind. How to get rid of fear?
When he says abiding in the self, what we're talking about here is basically abiding in the silence. There's another spiritual teacher that I like named Osho. Osho was a 21st century uh, or late 20th century maybe early 21st century spiritual teacher. And the way I like how he teaches it in one of his books called Awareness is that um, the way you sort of awaken into this transcendent consciousness is you practice the habit of watching yourself. You're watching your thoughts, you're watching your emotions, you're watching your sensations, you're watching your perceptions. What happens is that as you practice this habit of watching yourself, you start to awaken to your higher dimensional consciousness as pure watchfulness, pure witnessing consciousness, pure awareness. And in that watchfulness, in that pure awareness, there's perfect silence. And we can marry that concept with Ramana Maharshi by understanding that when Ramana says that you are abiding in the self, like what does that actually mean, right? Because the mind can't understand abiding in the self because the self transcends the mind, the egoic mind. So maybe a way that would help you make this really comprehensible is to abide in the self simply means to reach a point of spiritual practice where you are no longer identified as the thinking, feeling, perceiving, sensing consciousness, but as the silence or the witnessing watchfulness that is aware of the thinking, feeling, sensing, perceiving experience. And so as you move out of being identified with thought, emotions, sensations, perceptions, and you begin to awaken as the watchfulness of thoughts, emotions, sensations, and perceptionists, that resting in that watchfulness is what could be understood as abiding in the self or resting as awareness. All these words that can be really complicated to understand, hopefully now can make a hell of a lot more sense.
What is fear? It is only a thought. If there is anything beside the self, there is reason to fear. Who sees the second? First, the ego arises and sees objects as external. If the ego does not rise, the self alone exists, and there is no second. For anything external to oneself implies the seer within. Seeking it there will arise no doubt, no fear, not only fear, all other thoughts centered around the ego will disappear along with it. This method seems to be quicker than the usual one of cultivating qualities alleged necessary for salvation. All bad qualities center around the ego. When the ego is gone, realization results by itself. There are neither good nor bad qualities in the self. The self is free from all qualities. Qualities pertain to the mind only. It is beyond quality. If there is unity, there will also be duality. The numeral 1 gives rise to other numbers. The truth is neither 1 nor 2. It is as it is.
All right. Okay. I'm laughing a little bit here because I know how complicated that can all sound. Um, and I also know how brilliant Ramana is. Just, I have so much reverence and respect and love for his teachings. He's such a master. Um, I want to say a few things here, okay? One thing he said that what is fear? Fear is that which arises from the mind. That's me paraphrasing him. That is so profound because if you know my teachings, you know that I also talk a lot about mind science and I talk about other teachings like law of attraction. So one of the, I think, most challenging things in spirituality is how do you marry the concepts of non-duality, which is what we're talking about here. What is non-duality is transcending the duality of ego, person, world, and awakening into unity consciousness. That's all non-duality is. How do you marry non-duality with law of attraction? The idea that your thoughts create your reality, that what you think manifests in your physical world, right? because for a lot of people who I have worked with who are interested in spirituality, one of the things that might, especially Westerners, I notice, what kind of turns them off about spirituality, specifically non-duality, or this idea of transcending the egoic mind, is like they'll say, "Well, Philip, a lot of these people who are teaching these concepts, a lot of them look like they're broke, like they don't have any money, or like they struggle financially, and there's nothing enlightened about poverty." And I think that's a very important insight. Ramana Maharshi was known. And for those of you who are watching this who might know a little bit more about him than I do, I apologize if I get this wrong. But my understanding was that at a very young age, he basically threw away currency. He never touched a rupee, Indian currency, for most of his adult life. He basically pushed away personal finance from his existence. He didn't want anything to do with it. And that might have a lot to do with a lot of the traditions and spirituality at that time in India. As I teach spirituality, my brand of spirituality, financial wealth is very much a part of enlightenment. And if that's what you desire, you can absolutely have it. And to me, you can be, just because you're meditating all day and you have a lot of love in your heart doesn't necessarily mean you've mastered reality if within your heart is also the desire for material wealth, but because you don't know how to attract it, you give up on it. That's not, there's nothing enlightened about that, in my view. So the reason why I bring all this up is because when he said the word fear, it gave me an opportunity to just interconnect law of attraction to help create a unified understanding of the nature of reality. And I'll explain it like this. When you exist in transcendence, so let's say you have transcended the egoic mind and you're abiding in the self, or you're resting in awareness, or you're resting as silence. You're no longer identified with thoughts, emotions, sensations, perceptions. You're in that moment of pure silence. And many of us have had moments, especially if you're a more advanced spiritual practitioner, you probably have moments throughout the day where you're abiding as the self. You may not be able to do it, continuously, but you at least know what that feels like. What you'll notice is that whenever fear arises within the consciousness, it's always the egoic mind that's also rising at the exact same time. In other words, when you are in transcendence, there is no fear. And this is why they say that enlightenment is like the end of desire, right? It's not, I think that's also a misunderstanding. It's not so much the end of desire, because enlightenment itself is a desire. So that is nonsensical. What we're really talking about here is it's the end of attachment to desire. And this is another big part of spirituality that's really, I think, poorly understood, is that the objective of spiritual light enlightenment isn't to abandon your desires, to let go of all materialism, and to, surrender to having nothing. That's not spirituality as I teach it. What it is it's letting go of the need for it to achieve happiness, understanding that there is a higher dimensional level of happiness that transcends duality, right? In other words, if my happiness is based on having a new car and I get that car, then very soon the new car aroma wears off and I'm back to square one, where I'm seeking again for happiness. And then maybe I want a relationship. And I'm like, okay, cool. I hit the club, meet beautiful woman, right? And we start dating. And then all of a sudden, my happiness, the happiness that I thought, sure, it brings me some happiness, but the true happiness that I was thinking it was going to bring me, it doesn't bring me. And now I'm back to seeking, right? And this goes on and on and on with any permutation of desire you can imagine. And that's because the true happiness that you're ultimately seeking is the happiness that comes from having a soul, or in other words, from awakening into your true self. In other words, abiding as the self. In other words, resting as awareness. In other words, achieving enlightenment. That's the true happiness because that happiness transcends duality, right? It transcends everything, whether you have money, you have relationships, you have physical health, you have youth, no matter what it is that in the world can come into existence, if it is temporal, transient, in other words, it will eventually disappear, it cannot be the true source of happiness because who you are is eternal, right? And so the way this all connects to law of attraction is that very oftentimes we use law of attraction to try to manifest the material things of the world, right? Um, and every single time we are focusing our mind on attracting, like visualizing the things that we want in order to attract material things, what we're subtly doing there is we're implying that the thing, the happiness that we truly seek does not come from the self, the supreme self, or abiding as the self. It comes from something in the world that's ultimately transient. And this creates great suffering, as the Buddha talked about. And this is where this confusion arises and this idea of you need to let go of desire to achieve true happiness, right? Because for some people, if you're highly attached unconsciously or consciously, you're highly attached to material things for your happiness, then you might need to let go of those desires, forget about them in order to reach a point where you can experience the true happiness that comes from the self. But what you'll come to see is that as you abide as the true self, and as fear gets banished from your consciousness, and not just fear, when you abide as the true self, as Ramana talks about, it's not just fear that gets banished. Anxiety gets banished. Worry gets banished. Sadness gets banished. Hatred gets banished. Self-doubt gets banished. Basically, all negative emotions and also the polar opposites, right? The happiness that is the opposite of sadness disappears. The joy that is the opposite of sadness also disappears. But it's not so much that joy and happiness disappear, it's that you awaken into a type of joy, into a type of happiness that transcends your previous understanding of happiness and joy. The happiness and joy that you thought you wanted that would come from the material world, that happiness, that joy, which really isn't true happiness and true joy because it's contingent upon the things of the world, which are ultimately transient, that happiness and that joy dissolves away, just like sadness and all the negative emotions dissolve away when you achieve enlightenment. And what replaces it is a non-duality, a type of happiness, in other words, a type of happiness that has no opposite, a happiness without sadness, a joy that transcends the world, and a peace that passes all understanding, as taught by the many religions and spiritual traditions of the world. Um, and when you abide in this true state of non duality, of a happiness without an opposite, or as Ramana would probably say if he were here, as you abide in the Supreme Self, then what happens is you become a law of attraction, you become a magnet for attracting into your life the material things that are representative of this higher dimensional consciousness. And that includes not just, you know, um, material wealth like cars, money, houses, things like that, but you attract all things, right? All things. And that's how you marry this idea. And then you can focus your mind because remember, you're not letting go of the egoic mind completely. You're not completely um, losing your capacity to think. That's crazy. What you're doing is instead of being identified with thought, you're just recognizing, like we talked about before, that you're more than your thought. So thought becomes more like a calculator. When I need to calculate something, I take my mind out, my thinking mind, and I say, I want this, I want that. And you're like using the calculator, right? And you focus on what you want, and that's fine. But now you're not focusing on what you want because you think that that's going to create your happiness. Now you're focusing on those things because they are a reflection of the happiness that you already are. And then when you're done thinking about it and focusing on it, then you put the calculator back in your pocket and you go back into non-duality or into pure consciousness. And then things start to really come into your life because now there's no longer resistance, because the resistance before is, if I don't get it, I won't be happy, right? And then if you get it, it won't make you happy anyways, because again, you're getting attached to the things of the world. But when you're resting in this higher dimensional bliss of the supreme self, and then you are consciously choosing to think when you want to think, and then putting your thinking mind away because you have control over your consciousness now. Now you're detached. Now you're truly blissful, truly happy. And now you can become a co-creator with the universe.
Difficulty is to be in the thought-free state. Reality is simply the loss of the ego. Destroy the ego by seeking its identity. Because the ego is no entity, it will automatically vanish and reality will shine forth by itself. This is the direct method, whereas all other methods are done only retaining the ego. In those paths there arise so many doubts, and the eternal question remains to be tackled finally. But in this method, the final question is the only one, and it is raised from the very beginning. No sadhanas are necessary for engaging in this quest.
Have you seen God? I asked. And if you have, can you enable me to see him? I am willing to pay any price, even my life, but your part of the bargain is that you must show me God. No, he answered. I cannot show you God or enable you to see God, because God is not an object that can be seen. God is the subject. He is the seer. Don't concern yourself with objects that can be seen. Find out who the seer is. He also added, you alone are God, as if to rebuke me for looking for a God who is outside and apart from me.
Fire, man, pure fire. So really quick, he's saying that basically, um, show me God, show me enlightenment, right? If that's where your mind is right now, then what that means is you're still thinking that God is a concept, right? Because remember, the egoic mind is mental constructs. Think about the metaphor I've used in other videos, if you've watched them, where I talk about like the idea of the matrix, where the matrix is a universe of mental constructs, of labels, names, identities that are all based on thoughts, and mental constructs. And what he's saying is that in the Eastern traditions, uh, they don't use the term mental constructs. They use the term objects. I don't like object subject because a lot of people get confused with that. So maybe as a Westerner, I like to use the term mental constructs. So God is not a mental construct. God is not something that you can, um, with your thinking mind, comprehend. God is the witnessing consciousness, the watchfulness of what you really are when you're not identified with the ego, and that you and God are not separate from each other, right? You are God. You are God consciousness, right?
At the conclusion of his words, he looked at me, and as he gazed into my eyes, my whole body began to tremble and shake. A thrill of nervous energy shot through my body. My nerve endings felt as if they were dancing, and my hair stood on end. Within me, I became aware of the spiritual heart. This is not the physical heart. It is, rather, the source and support of all that exists. Within this heart, I saw or felt something like a closed bud. It was very shiny and bluish. With the Maharshi looking at me, and with myself in a state of inner silence, I felt this bud open and bloom. I use the word bud, but this is not an exact description. It would be more correct to say that something that felt bud-like opened and bloomed within me in the heart. And when I say heart, I don't mean that the flowering was located in a particular place in the body. This heart of my heart, was neither inside the body nor out of it. I can't give a more exact description of what happened.
One thing I'll quickly say here too is as you're listening to that, don't run off and start thinking to yourself like, oh, I need to imagine a spiritual heart opening inside me. If I don't visualize a blue flower opening inside me, then I'm not enlightened, right? One of the tricky things about enlightenment is we're moving out of objectivity and we're moving into subjectivity. In other words, every single person is going to have different experiences of what enlightenment means based on their own cultural upbringing. So, whoever this woman is, and whatever she has spent her life doing is going to influence what she sees, what she visualizes, and what enlightenment visually or auditory or whatever is understood by her personal life experiences. And they're going to be different for you. Right. We can come up with universal principles and come up with a framework of understanding enlightenment, which is one of the things that I've worked on through my writing. However, just understand that it's going to be different for everyone and don't get too caught up in the specifics of what they're talking about. Like, if you were to ask me, Philip, like, sum up what she just said, I would just simply say, instead of trying to instead of trying to come up with a definition of the spiritual heart, I would just say, forget about all that. She just had an awakening experience. In other words, that silence within her is starting to become self-aware.
The keystone of the Maharshi's teaching is his self-inquiry, or Atma-Vishara, his infallible direct path to self-realization, coupled with total devotional surrender to God, self, or Guru. Broadly speaking, Sri Bhagavan tells us that the immortal self, or Satchitananda, or pure existence consciousness awareness bliss, is already there inherent in each of us. The difficulty is we do not recognize that, our true nature, or essential I amness, because it is veiled and obscured by many latent tendencies and habits of the egotistic mind, which act as a mirror and project a dream of the world, the body, and the mind. Our identification with the mind and body is the chief reason for our failure to know ourselves as we really are. Through persistent self-inquiry, devotion, and surrender of the egotistic mind to God or the Satguru in the spiritual heart, this obscuration and identification is gradually and gracefully removed until the immortal self is realized. That is the full power of absolute consciousness and is known. The world is seen as real because the substrate is perceived to be as Brahman. In January 1938, Somerset Maugham, the British novelist, visited Ramanasramam for a few hours. The brief contact he had with Bhagavan inspired Maugham so much he decided to use him as the model for a fictional guru in The Razor's Edge, his masterpiece which was published a few years later in 1944. Maugham also wrote a non-fiction account of his visit in an essay entitled The Saint, which was published 20 years after the event in 1958. The following account, which is taken from this essay, records Maugham's impressions of this meeting with Bhagavan. He uttered a few words of cordial greeting and sat on the ground not far from the pallet on which I lay. After the first few minutes, during which his eyes with a gentle benignity rested on my face, He ceased to look at me, but, with a sidelong stare of peculiar fixity, gazed, as it were, over my shoulder. His body was absolutely still, but now and then one of his feet tapped lightly on the earthen floor. He remained thus, motionless, for perhaps 15 minutes, and they told me later that he was concentrating in meditation upon me. Then he came to, if I may so put it, and again looked at me. He asked me if I wished to say anything to him, or ask any question. I was feeling weak and ill, and said so, whereupon he smiled and said, "Silence is also conversation." He turned his head away slightly, and resumed his concentrated meditation, again looking, as it were, over my shoulder. No one said a word. The other persons in the hut, standing by the door, kept their eyes riveted upon him. After another 15 minutes, he got up, bowed, smiled farewell, and, slowly leaning on his stick, he limped out of the hut, followed by his disciples.
So one thing, as we get to near to the end of this, one of the things that made Ramana Maharshi very famous throughout the world was many people said that in this man's presence, they would know God, or they would see God, or they would experience a deep inner silence just being in his presence. The reason why is because when you're looking into his eyes, Ramana's eyes, like for example, take the average person, right? When you're looking into their eyes, what you're basically seeing in their eyes is a consciousness that's identified as a person, right? So it's like, here I am, Phillip Lew, and I am identified as Phillip Lew. I'm having a conversation with you. You're identified as your first name, last name, where you're from. And so we have one egoic mind that's having a conversation with another egoic mind. And that's just normal, uh, normal conversation, right? But Ramana was different because this is a guy who basically had achieved such a high degree of enlightenment or transcendence that when you're looking into his eyes, you're not seeing a consciousness that's identified as a person named Ramana. When you're looking into his eyes, what you're seeing is a enlightened being or a transcendent being that is the awareness or the pure witnessing consciousness of the one called Ramana, right? And so, in other words, when you're talking to Ramana, you're actually interacting with God, right? The God within him, the higher consciousness with him. And this God consciousness is a unified collective consciousness. It's a unified field of pure being. So you're getting direct download of that higher dimensional consciousness that he has awakened inside of him, right? And so it's almost like he is watching himself talking to you. And when I say he's watching himself, that person called himself, he knows that that person he's no longer identified as that person. He's so strongly grounded and rooted in transcendence into higher dimensional silence that he is the God consciousness, right? And that's what's so transformative about his presence. And this is something that all of us can achieve. And one of the easiest ways to achieve this, um, and I want to be careful about the word easy because it's probably better to say simple because something can be simple, but not necessarily easy, right? Like, so it's simple, but it's not necessarily easy. And so the simplest way to achieve that level of transcendence is to practice the habit of always being watchful of yourself. And over time, you gradually crystallize this higher consciousness, this observing presence. And then over time, if you persist and you're able to every single time you let go of the witnessing consciousness and you're back into personhood, you remember, oh wait, I'm not the person, I'm the witnessing consciousness. And then you go back to watching. And then you go back into personhood, back to watching, back to personhood, back to watching, back to personhood. This is the drama of spirituality. And over time, you start residing more and more and more as the witnessing consciousness, less and less and less as the person. And then as you exist as this witnessing consciousness, then you hit a point of what we could call a singularity, where you reach a point to where now the subject object in the Eastern tradition, right? Or in other words, the world, the body, all of that, it all collapses into a unified identity where now everything is the self, right? Where you know yourself as the world. Now, if you haven't achieved this, don't try to understand any of my words. It's not going to make any sense, right? Because I'm describing something beyond language. But what is useful with language is to practice the habit of watching the self, right? Here I am. I'm not Phillip Lew. I am that which is aware of Phillip Lew, aware of the camera, aware of the video. I am the witnessing consciousness, not of this world. And as I stabilize and become grounded in that witnessing consciousness, I also become grounded in silence, bliss, peace, love. And eventually, I reach a point of singularity where I only know myself, my true self, as that witnessing consciousness. And in that moment of singularity, where I'm permanently, eternally grounded in transcendence, then one can say that they have achieved enlightenment.
There is no greater mystery than this. Ourselves being the reality, we seek to gain reality. We think that there is something hiding our reality and that it must be destroyed before the reality is gained. It is ridiculous. A day will dawn when you will yourself laugh at your past efforts. That which will be on the day you laugh is also here and now. So it's a great game of pretending, yes. In Yoga Vashishta it is said, what is real is hidden from us, but what is false is revealed as true. We are actually experiencing the reality only. Still, we do not know it. Is it not a wonder of wonders? The quest, who am I, is the axe with which to cut off the ego.
There it is, guys. I don't know how I feel about the language of the axe to cut off the ego. Again, that implies that you need to like kill yourself to achieve enlightenment or kill your ego. And again, I disagree with that. You are in how I teach enlightenment, you are simply learning to disidentify with your individuality so that you know yourself as transcendent silence that is having what we could call a dream of being an individual. Because when you're identified with the individual, then the witnessing consciousness is asleep, right? Because you're not present as a witnessing consciousness. The witnessing consciousness is sleeping, and then you awaken as the ego. And then when the ego, I guess we could say when you're no longer identified with the ego, now you have awakened as that higher consciousness, right? But in order to live on earth and have an earthly experience, you have to be an ego. You have to be an individual, right? It's just that you're no longer solely identified as the individual. There is a ever-present witnessing consciousness that's always in the background of your experience, watching every single present moment. And you know yourself to be that witnessing consciousness. And so really what we're talking about here is that you're adding to your identity and not subtracting. So I hope this video helped you, and I look forward to making more.